Good morning. Thanks, I didn't let you reply. I was just ready to go. If we haven't met before, my name's Kizzy and I'm the curate here at St. Helens and at Christ Church as well and St. Barnabas. But so I've been tasked with speaking on very familiar passages. You may or may not remember that this year we've been focusing a little bit more on the Old Testament and how it points to Jesus, but obviously we've had a bit of a break in that because it's been Easter, so it's been all important to look at the Gospels. So today I wanted to dive back into the Old Testament with Psalm 23. Probably one of the most famous of all the Psalms. You might remember it was the theme tune to the Vicar of Dibley, but a little bit old now, that reference, eh? But and there are numerous hymns and songs, obviously we've sung one today already, inspired by this psalm. It's a common choice of reading at funerals. I expect because people, even if they don't come to church, have often heard it, and many people find comfort within it. So in some senses, it was hard to know quite where to begin with these words that are likely very familiar to many of you. If you are hearing them for the first time, that's great as well, though. But this psalm and the New Testament passage, as you heard, they entwine beautifully to teach us a few things about Jesus' character. So I'm going to have a bash at unpacking some of that. And when we're reading the Bible, it's really important to ask questions about the place and the time that what we're reading was actually written. It helps us to better understand what it would have meant to those who heard it originally, and that helps us to better grasp what God is trying to communicate through his word as we consider how it applies to our lives today. Psalm 23 then is written by David. He spent his early life as a shepherd before becoming God's chosen king of Israel. And it seems to fall somewhere between a poem and a prayer. It's sort of both and neither. And you can hear him sometimes speaking directly to God and sometimes speaking of God, as though David is reflecting with gratitude upon the role that God plays within his life. But having said how important it is to think about contextual questions when you read the Bible, I realised that for most of my life, I'd never thought that much about how David's location and context might impact the meaning of this particular psalm. I think I mistakenly presumed that the metaphor is very obvious and self-explanatory, and I think I had a little bit of learning to do this week. I wonder how many of us, when we read this psalm and we hear about God making us lie in green pastures, I wonder what that brings to mind. I wonder how many of us tend to picture something a little bit like this, if I can have the slide. I know that's how I've tended to picture these words in my mind. An idyllic field, luscious green grass, more than the sheep could ever possibly need. There's a lovely little brook running through it. They're safely hemmed in with hedges. It paints a picture of an easy life. Hassle-free, luxurious. I don't know about you, but for me, I know I'm richly blessed, but there are seasons and circumstances within my life that don't seem to match that picture much at all. And in those moments, then these words can become difficult and even painful to read. We begin to wonder why God doesn't seem to be leading us into that luxurious rest that David seems to be mentioning. I know for me, even this week, just first reading this passage to prepare, I probably felt a bit like that. I was exhausted and easily overwhelmed, and I felt like, yeah, sure, God can do those things, I know that, but he doesn't seem to be doing them for me at the moment. But I learned a little bit about the geography of Israel and the role of a shepherd in Near Eastern culture that's really refreshed how I've understood this psalm, and you may already know it, but hopefully it will be refreshing for you too. I mean, it's not exactly a huge surprise, I'm aware, but I just had never really properly thought about it. That obviously David wasn't shepherding in the rainy, green Welsh hills or the rolling South Downs. Like the pastures which David would have been accustomed to grazing his sheep in are likely to have looked much more like this. It's this landscape that David would have been so familiar with that he undoubtedly had in mind when writing this prayer, this song of praise. The thing is, if we think of green pastures that look full of lush grass, hemmed in with hedges, with ample water on hand, the sheep barely need to move ever again. They've got more than they could ever desire. The role of the shepherd is somewhat diminished. He doesn't need to be all that involved. We frequently see sheep in this country left to roam the fields for quite a significant amount of time. They have all they need. But in Israel, historically, the role of the shepherd was vital to the survival of the sheep. I'm not saying this to insult British farmers, who I know very little about, admittedly, so I could be wrong about the British farming, but I'm just trying to say that the style of shepherding is quite different because the landscape is so different. The hills pictured here, they don't look especially green at first glance, but that is what in Israel they would call green pasture. They contain enough small green shoots sprouting up amid the rocks to feed the sheep if you cover enough ground and you know where to look for it. So apparently shepherds here, they traditionally walk ahead of the flock, calling them on. They spend all their time with them. They have great care for each sheep. They call them onward. They need to keep the sheep moving frequently to new pastures throughout the day, covering enough ground to make sure all their needs can be met. The sheep are entirely dependent upon the shepherd to lead them to suitable green pastures, and what they find there is just enough sustenance for today, no more, no less. This casts a whole new light on this psalm, and if we're ever feeling like we're just treading water, like only able to handle the day at hand, David isn't saying that God, as our shepherd, makes our lives a breeze, but that he leads us to all that we need for today, one day at a time, as we follow him. God helps us to navigate the twists and turns that life throws at us for his name's sake, we're told. As in, so that we recognize that he is who he says he is, so that we realize that he is faithful and trustworthy. This psalm is a picture of the peace that comes from a close relationship with God, the Good Shepherd, who walks daily ahead of us, calling us to remain close to him. One thing I've always found a bit of a strange concept in this psalm as well, but never really looked into before, was the phrase, "Your rod and staff, they comfort me." For one, I probably imagined that a rod and staff were kind of the same thing. They just sound like a big stick to me. But also, I always thought it really strange that it would be wooden sticks that would be a source of comfort, especially in the presence of God. Surely that's enough of a comfort that we would need. But unsurprisingly, turns out that these sticks and what they represent is actually pretty interesting. So, firstly, the rod is defensive. It's a sturdy stick that can be used as a weapon to strike when wild animals attack the flock. David himself, in 1 Samuel 17, recalls to King Saul having used a rod to fend off wild lions and bears when they tried to carry away his own sheep back when he was a shepherd. So to find comfort in God's rod is to have confidence in his protection when danger strikes. But the staff, on the other hand, is the curved crook we might more associate with shepherds, the kind that we tend to see in the nativity plays in the hands of dressing-gown-clad children. And when the sheep wander off, this curved crook is designed to be placed around their neck to gently just guide them back towards the group, to draw them back to the right path. The staff helps the shepherd to keep his sheep close to him, to gather them back in when they stray. So David is expressing a deep trust in the Lord, that even when he walks through the valley of the shadow of death, when he faces the most painful, bewildering, and difficult of circumstances, David knows that God can ultimately be trusted to protect him, to draw him in close, to lead him as he fumbles in the darkness, to call him in a familiar voice to stay on the right path, even when the road ahead looks veiled in shadow. So Jesus then, in telling parables about a good shepherd and being the gate of the sheepfold, he's leaning upon what was likely a familiar metaphor for his hearers. They would have recognized that talking about a shepherd and his sheep is how they spoke of God and how he relates to his people. That means that here Jesus isn't only saying something about his own character being a little bit like that of a shepherd, but he's alluding to his divinity. This parable follows on from a discussion about whether Jesus really was or wasn't the Messiah. That was really the talk of the day. The Messiah is the one that God promised to send. He would save his people from the grasp of sin. And not only does David speak of God as a good shepherd in the Psalms, but also in the book of Ezekiel, one of the prophecies, one of the foretold promises about this Messiah was that they would be like a shepherd for all God's people. So in using this familiar shepherding reference about himself, Jesus is aligning himself with God's very character. It's a huge claim for his hearers to take in. He is pointing to his own divine identity as the promised shepherd, the Messiah, one with the living God. What's also interesting here is that actually Jesus is talking to Pharisees. He's addressing a group of Pharisees who are questioning him and who don't recognize him for who he really is. Those were the teachers of the law of Moses among the Jewish people. Their whole lifestyle was incredibly devoted to God, yet through the keeping of laws and traditions. Rules upon rules were created to pad out how they understood God's commandments and to help them to keep them better. More legalistically, one might say. But Jesus was often critical of this group, as you may well know, although it's as if they'd lost the heart of the relationship that the law was designed to enable between God and his people. Instead, the Pharisees had become so focused upon law and tradition that they hadn't left any space for compassion. They'd become judgmental of those less fastidious in law-keeping than themselves. And it's to these people that Jesus addresses his parable. In stating that he himself is the gate through which one can enter the sheep pen of God's people, there being no other legitimate way, it's a stark challenge to the Pharisees, who perhaps considered their holiness to be earned through their actions. He's even accusing them of trying to lead God's people astray like thieves. Conversely, the good shepherd's sheep know his voice. Jesus says that his people recognize his voice, and in turn, he leads them into life in all its fullness. Not life in all its ease and glamour, but in all the richness of a life full of deep and lasting love, lived in relationship with the one by whom and for whom we were created, with just enough strength for today, the promise of freedom from sin and shame, the gift of nonsensical peace, the promise of hope and a lasting future. We enter into God's kingdom, the heavenly feast that David foresaw and sang about at the end of Psalm 23, not by any right that we've earned or achieved, but through Jesus alone, who is merciful and loving and gracious. All that said, at times it can seem really hard to make out Jesus' voice among the clamor of voices that vie for our attention. Jesus sounds confident that his sheep recognize him when he calls, that we know him for who he really is. But are we making sure to be listening out for him by the Holy Spirit? Are we familiarizing ourselves with his voice from all he says in the Gospels? Are we allowing his voice to speak louder than the rest of the noise around us in guiding our lives, in drawing us close to him like the gentle pull of a staff? I say that as a challenge to myself as much as any of you. Whether anyone takes it or not, this is important to me too. I have recently come back to Mark to just walk slowly through a gospel and remember what Jesus' voice sounds like and what happens to those that encounter him in person. I would invite you to do something similar if you'd like. Psalm 23, in its soulful invitation to bring our lives under God's care, is lived out as we trust and follow Jesus, the Good Shepherd, day by day into the fullness of life that he brings. Amen.